Alright, baby. So, July the 5th was flying. Look at that airplane go over the sky of that cityscape. Alright, so flying. I went in an airplane. It was exactly... Oh, hold on. Wasn't exactly. It was exciting as can be. We flew over the country far away to a hotel by the sea. We checked into the airport and then we had to wait a long time to board the plane through the desperate gate. The aircraft was as the tarmac and enormous silver birds. The engines were screaming so loudly I could not hear a word. An attendant was on board to greet us. She showed us to our seats. I sat by a window with Teddy and ate my chewy sweets. Then we taxied down the runway. I hugged Teddy tight. The engines roared and the aircraft soared when we took off on my very first flight. We flew over the rooftops above the hills and trees, way up high in a clear blue sky across the salty seas. That's flying. She had so much fun, right? The next one in our other book is Sleeping Beauty. There was once a king and a queen who has no children, which grieved them more than can be imagined. They went to all the healing waters in the world. They made vows. They went on pilgrimages. They did everything they could think of, but it was all to no good. At last, however, the queen did have a baby, a little girl. There was a fine christening party, and all the fairies of the kingdom, they were 7 of them, were made godmothers to the princess, so that each of them could give her a gift. And it was custom of the fairies at that time, so she was endowed with every good quality imaginable. After the baptism itself, all the guests came back to the king's palace, where there was a great banquet in honor of the fairies. Each of them sat at the table, and a rich cloth was spread for her, and on a golden casket, containing knives, forks, and spoons of fine gold, all studded with diamonds and rubies. But just as everyone had sat down, in came an old fairy, who had not been invited because for more than 50 years she had not come out of her tower, so that everyone thought she must be dead or else under a spell. The king had a place laid for her, but they could not manage to find a golden casket such as the others had, because only the seats of 7 had been made. The old fairy thought that she was being slighted, so she grumbled to herself in a threatening way. One of the younger fairies sitting beside her heard this, and fearing that she might be giving a little princess some unlikely gift, went to hide behind the curtains. When the banquet was over, so as to be the last to speak, and thus be able to put right as far as she could any harm that the old fairy might do. Now the fairies began to present their gifts to the princess. The youngest granted her this boon. Then she should be the most beautiful girl in all the world. The next, she should be the wittiest. The third, however, she could do the most gracefully. The fourth, that she would be a dance perfectly. The fifth, that she could sing like a nightingale. And the sixth, that she would be able to play sweetly on all the kinds of music and instruments. Now it was the old fairy's turn, wagging her head more in spite than from her age. She said that the princess would prick herself with a distaff, and that would be the death of her. Everybody shuddered at this terrible gift, and all burst into tears. At that moment the young fairy stepped out from behind the curtains and said in a loud voice, "Take courage, your majesty, your daughter will not die." True. I have the power to undo completely what my elder sister has prophesied. and the princess will indeed prick her hand with a distaff. But far from dying of it, she will only fall into a deep sleep which shall last 100 years, at the end of which time the king's son shall come and wake her. The king tried to avert the ill fortune promised by the old fairy, by at once having it proclaimed that no one was allowed to spin with a distaff, or to have a distaff in their home, on pain of death. After 15 or 16 years, the king and queen having gone to stay in one of their country houses, it chanced that the little princess, roaming around in the palace, was wandering from room to room and floor to floor, came to the top of one of the towers, and found a little attic, where a kindly old woman was sitting spinning. For this old woman had never heard of the king's orders against to use the distaff. "What are you doing, my good woman?" asked the princess. "Why, spinning, my pretty dear," answered the old woman. Who does not know who her visitor was? "How nice it was," said the princess. "How do you do it? Here, let me have it, to see if I can do it as well." No sooner had she taken hold of the distaff than she pricked her hand, because she was rather hasty, and snatched it, and became anyhow the fairies would have it so, and down fell in a faint. The kind old woman was in a talking and shouted for help. People came running from all directions, dashed water over the princess, undid her stains, crafted her hands, and rubbed her temples with hungry water. But nothing would bring her round. Meanwhile the king had come home. Hearing the noise, he rushed up to the tower, and seeing what had happened, remembered what the old fairies had promised. Rightly guessing that there was no help for it since the fairy's foot-tail must be, he had the princess carried to the finest room of the palace, and laid on a bed, and hung with gold and silver brooches. She looked like an angel. She was so beautiful, for her faint had not faded the bright colors of her complexion. Her cheeks were the color of pale pink carnations, and her lips were the color, only her eyes were like coral, only her eyes were closed. They would still have her breathing softly, and at the right she could not be dead. The king ordered his people to leave her in peace till that hour should come for her to be awakened. The good fairy, who had saved her life by ordering her to sleep for 100 years, was in the kingdom of Madaquin, 12,000 leagues away. When the accident happened, but she was told of it within the intensity by the lower dwarf in 7 league boots. This is boots in which one can walk 7 leagues in a stride. Wow. The fairy set out at once to arrive in an hour, driving a chariot driven by dragons, all of fire. The king came out and gave her his arm as she dismounted from the chariot. She said he had done her all the best, but as she thought of everything beforehand, it struck her that the prince would be so lonely all alone in that great palace when she at least awoke. So this is what she did. She touched everything in the palace with her magic wand, except the king and the queen, the governess and the maids of honor, and the wanting gentlewoman, the gentlemen of the bedchamber, the officers and the stewards, the cooks, the scullions, the grooms, the guards, the ushers, the pages, the footmen. She touched all the horses and the stables, and the stable boy too, and mischief in the yard, and Poaf the princess' little lapdog, who was curled up in her bed. As soon as she touched them, they all fell asleep, never to wake until their mistress did, so as to be always ready to serve her when she should have need of them, even in spite in front of the kitchen fire, on which partridges and pheasants were roasting, stopped turning, and the fire died down. It was all done in a moment, for fairies are fast workers when they choose. The king and queen, having kissed their dear child without waking her, left the palace and forbid anyone to go near it. Indeed, it was not necessary to forbid it, for it was a matter of minutes. They grew up in the borders of the park such a quantity of trees, both great and small, of barriers and brambles, all twins together, that no man nor beast could get through it, so that nothing was left to sight even from the great way off but the tops of the palace towers. No one doubted that the fairy had done this on purpose, so that the princess would not be bothered with sightseers during the long sleep. 100 years went by, another royal family came to the throne, and the son of the king, who was then reigning, was out hunting near the old palace. He asked what were the towers he could see above the tips of the great thick wood. Everyone answered according to what he had heard, some saying that it was an old haunted castle, others that it was a palace where the local witches held their meetings. But the most common opinion was that the great orc lived there, and that he carried off thither all the children he could catch and eat them at his ease without being followed, for he alone was able to force his way through the wood. The prince did not know what to believe, but just then the old courtman up and said, "Your Highness, it's more nor 50 yards gone since I heard my old father say that there was a princess in the castle, the prettiest that you'd ever seen, and she was bound to sleep there 100 years, and to be awakened by the king's son. Who was that one? Who was that one for her? Who was the one for her?" Hearing that the young prince felt himself all on fire, and the flash, he determined to fulfill the prophecy, and spurred on by love and glory. He resolved to see for himself how things stood. No sooner had he advanced to the wood than all the brambles and brambles and all the great trees bent down to let him pass. He walked towards the palace along the great avenue of trees, surprised to one that none of his servants could follow, because the trees had closed up behind him as soon as he had passed by. None the less he went on, for a young prince in love is always brave. He came into the great forecourt, where all met his eyes. At first sight was enough to freeze his blood. There was a fearful silence. The appearance of death was everywhere. Bodies of men and animals, seemingly dead, were stretched all around, but he could tell by the red noses and burry complexions of the ushers that they were only sleeping. The gobelets in their hands still held for a few drops of wine, and to show that they had fallen asleep while drinking. He went into the great courtyard paved in all marble, and up the staircase into the great rooms. There were guards were drawn up with their muskets and their shoulders, all snarling away. He passed through the room after room, full of ladies and gentlemen in waiting, all fast asleep, none sitting, and some on their feet. At last he came to a room all over gilt. There on the bed, with all the curtains drawn back, he saw the most beautiful sight in his whole life, a princess who seemed to be about 15 or 16 years old, and had something mysteriously splendid, and as it were shining about her. Trembling all over, he came nearer to admire her, and fell onto his knees beside her. At that moment the spell ceased to work, and the princess awoke, and bending on him, what I must call a lovely glance indeed, considering it was the first time she had set eyes on him, said, "Is it you, my prince? You have been a long time coming." The prince was overjoyed to hear this, and delighted with the way in which she spoke it, so that he could not think how to express his joy and gratitude. He assured her that he loved her better than he did himself. The other things he told her were rather confusing. He cried a good deal. They cried a good deal and were tongue-tied with love. He was in even greater confession than she was, and no wonder she had time to think over what she would say, for it seems, though history tells us nothing of this, that the good fairy had arranged for her to have pleasant dreams during her long sleep. They talked for hours without getting to the end of half of the things they meant to tell each other. Meanwhile, the palace had come to life, and all the time the princess and everyone bethought himself of going about his business, but as not everyone was in love, and they felt ravenously hungry, the maid of honor was as hungry as any of them, and losing her patience called out to her mistress that dinner was ready. The prince helped the princess to rise, and she already dressed in magnificent clothes, but he had the sense not to tell her that she was wearing his grandmother's fashions, with a high neckline. She was none the less beautiful for that. They went into the dining room, all hung with mirrors, where dinner was serving by the officers of her household, while a band of violins and hautboys played quite old music most softly, tunes that had not been heard for 100 years. Afterwards, the chaplain married them in the palace chapel without delay, and they lived happily ever after. Look at that, baby. Some people just stick and stay. You pick someone, you stick and stay. It's not a bad thing, because then they'll have so many memories together. If they got together when they were 15 and died when they were 80, they have so many memories together. I absolutely believe in picking your person, sticking and staying. But I do think, like the Mennonites do, or not the Mennonites, what are they? Methodist. Are they Methodist? One of the churches say that you should be able to date around, like date people, see who you actually like. I think that's a good idea. I think they have it right. I don't think that you should just pick one person and stick and stay, but you should date and see who you like and make sure that you guys are on the same page for what you like to do and things like that. This way you have a compatible partner. Don't just pick someone absolutely opposite from you. I know opposites do attract, because it's like me, I'm kind of eccentric in some ways, and your father's kind of eccentric in other ways. We balance each other out when we're together, because I'll go off and buy 6 things of flour, but I always do that, and your father doesn't stop me from doing that. But Mama likes to have certain things in her house, and certain things, Mama just likes to have, like, money saved and just things going well, and, Mama obsesses over numbers and about certain things. But your father is more liberal on a lot of things, where your mama is not. And I'm more liberal on a lot of things, where your father is not. We just balance each other out because we were opposites and we attracted. Alright, baby. How about Mama loves you? I'll be right back.